Mr. Tauko Shikongo. Very happy that he could come from Montreal to be with us. He's currently the Senior Program Management Officer for the Access and Benefit Sharing Unit, serving the parties to the Nagoya Protocol on ABS. His unit has mission to provide support to parties in policy development, coordination, implementation, and review of issues related to access and benefit sharing. And prior to this position, he was one of the lead negotiators on the Nagoya Protocol. He's a Namibian national, so he was in the Namibia government, and his colleague Pierre Duplessis is listening to us online. And he previously served as head of the International Environmental Convention units in Namibia's Ministry of Environment and Tourism. So, Mr. Tauko, the floor is yours. We're all very interested.
Thank you, and good afternoon to all. Next slide. And thank you to the UK and Indonesian missions, as well as the Global Health Institute, for arranging this important gathering. In the previous sessions, as well as the statement from my colleague Vasi, there's been several pointers to Nagoya and the implications of that. So as a roadmap for this afternoon, I will take a quick overview of the CBD and the Nagoya Protocol, and then something of concern is the DSI process under the CBD. You call it here GST, I think. Yeah. And so what are we doing there? And then focus or zoom into the issues of mutual concern. Some of them has already been addressed, and then draw conclusion of that, and we throw the floor open. May I have the next slide, please? Maybe just keep on pressing. It's got animation. One more. Yes, go back. Very good. Now, as we recall, in the 80s, the world was troubled by climate change, the loss of the diversity of life, degrading lands, overexploitation of the marine resources, etc. And that led to the Rio Conference in 1992. And out of that conference came the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, the UN Convention to Combat Desertification, and then also the Convention on Biological Diversity. And this convention looks at the entire fascinating variety of life forms that we see around us, from genes to the ecosystems. And it has, when it was signed, it had 150 governments that signed it up, and it entered into force in May 29, December. And it now has, May 1992, and it's got now 196 parties. In terms of its governance structure, it's got a conference of parties that makes the decisions, and then it's got a subsidiary body on scientific, technical, and technical advice, which looks at the technical issues that they have to consider, and then provide recommendations to the conference parties. And then there is a body that is called the subsidiary body on implementation, which looks at what is the progress with regard to implementing the objectives of the convention. And for very specific areas, there are various working groups. One is, there was one on access and benefit sharing, one on protected areas, one on Article 80 that concerns traditional knowledge, innovation practices of indigenous local communities. And then we've got the two protocols and in the supplementary protocols, which is the Cartagena Protocol on Biosafety, and then the with its Nagoya Kuala Lumpur supplementary protocol, and then what is of concern to us here today, the Nagoya Protocol on access and benefit sharing. The Cartagena Protocol is focusing on the safe handling, transport, and use of living modified organisms that are developed using modern biotechnology, taking also into account risks to human health. And it's got the supplementary protocol on liability and redress to that. And then what is noteworthy about it is that it's got the biosafety clearinghouse where parties can then upload their information. Next slide. All of this is being done because the convention has the 3 objectives: to conserve biodiversity, to ensure that sustainable use of the components of biodiversity is maintained and promoted, as well as then the fair and equitable sharing of benefits that arise from the utilization of genetic resources. And that 3rd objective, it's what gave rise to the Nagoya Protocol on access and benefit sharing. Next slide. Now, what is the Nagoya Protocol? This protocol is attempting to regulate or govern access to genetic resources and the associated traditional knowledge of indigenous and local communities, as well as the sharing of the benefits arising from their utilization in a fair and equitable way. And it establishes predictable conditions for access to genetic resources through prior informed consent for access and mutually agreed terms for benefit sharing. And these implementation of Nagoya Protocol at national level will then be done through ABS legislation or other regulatory requirements. And all of this is to promote greater legal certainty and transparency for both the provider and the user of genetic resources. And that will be done including through compliance measures to monitor that genetic resources have been accessed in accordance with prior informed consent, and that mutually agreed terms and the utilization of genetic resources, including by designating effective checkpoints at any stage of the value chain, that being research, development, innovation, pre-commercialization, or commercialization. And so there will then be these national focal points and competent national authorities at national level that will serve as contact points for information to grant access or cooperate issuance of compliance. What is noteworthy about this protocol is that it's got provisions for specialized international access and benefit sharing instruments, and I'll come to that just now. And then there is a global multilateral benefit sharing mechanism for cases where it is not clear who can give prior informed consent, and especially in cases where it is of transboundary resources. Next slide. So why do we need to have such a protocol? When the convention came into place, the 3rd objective lagged behind in terms of implementation, and parties gave their concerns about it, and it led to the development of the voluntary bond guidelines in 2002. But given that they were voluntary, it was not really able to be implemented fully. And many of the laws that were adopted were considered an impediment to research as they restricted access to genetic resources. And developing countries as providers of genetic resources were concerned about the misappropriation of their genetic resources and the associated traditional knowledge. So there was thus a need for greater legal certainty and transparency. And this means for the providers to ensure that benefits are shared by users once they leave the provider country. And for the user, they wanted clear procedures for access to genetic resources. Next slide. I will just zoom into the benefit sharing because this is a topic that comes out quite a lot. So you've got the sources of benefit that will be out of utilization of genetic resources, subsequent applications, and commercialization. And the benefits are of 2 types. We've got the non-monetary benefits and we've got the monetary benefits. And these are to be shared with the party providing the resource, which can be the country of origin or a party that has acquired the resources in accordance with the CBD. And to govern that, you've got legislative, administrative, or policy measures where mutually agreed terms will then govern these bilateral transactional arrangement between the parties. Next slide. So access to the genetic resource will then be based on one of the principles of the CBD, that states have got sovereign rights over their natural resources, and therefore at national level, domestic ABS legislation regulatory requirements will be in place, and there will be requirement for prior informed consent of the providing party or the country of origin or the party that has acquired the resource in accordance with the CBD. And that once you've ensured that PIC or approval and involvement of IPLCs is obtained, if in the case where there is traditional knowledge, then access can be granted.
What is an IPLC? Sorry?
Indigenous people and local communities. Next slide. What is this PIC or prior informed consent? So you've got the measures that can be legislative or administrative or a policy, and they provide then legal certainty and clarity and transparency and the rules of procedure that should be fair and non-arbitrary, and then including the mutually agreed terms. And the information for that is needed is how to apply for PIC. The country must provide that information, and then the criteria and or processes for obtaining this PIC or approval and involvement of IPLCs. And then the mutually agreed terms may include dispute settlement mechanism, the benefit sharing in terms of IPR, for example, subsequent third-party use, and changes of intent once you have received the material. And then the government or competent authority can decide, and that should be clear and transparent written decision by the competent national authority, and then issue the permit or equivalent of access. And that is an evidence that the decision to grant PIC has been given, and then establishment of mutually agreed terms. And that is then notified on the ABS clearinghouse mechanism, where parties can then upload the information and for the wider use of all stakeholders. Next slide. Having said that, what are the issues in the protocol that are relevant to this discussion today? Among other things, parties recognized that further work was needed as a priority to develop access and benefit legislation or regulatory requirements which provide for the legal certainty, clarity, and transparency, taking into account special considerations in accordance with Article 8 of the protocol, and the need to ensure that the Nagoya Protocol and other relevant international instruments are implemented in a mutually supportive manner. And so in the slide there, I just provided the Article 8B on special consideration and what it states. There was a survey done, and 39 parties out of 105 has paid due regard to cases of present or imminent emergencies, and 26 parties have taken into consideration the need for an expeditious access to genetic resources. Next slide. Then there was a question on Article 4.4 on special international ABS instruments. This one is that the protocol is the instrument for the implementation of the access and benefit sharing provisions of the convention. However, where there is a specialized international access and benefit sharing instrument, if that apply, that is consistent with and does not run counter to the objectives of the convention and this protocol, this protocol does not apply for the party or parties to that specialized instrument in respect of the specific genetic resource covered by and for the purpose of the specialized instrument. There has been talks around this, and there is now a list of indicative criteria for a specialized international ABS instrument, which will be considered in our upcoming COP in December. Next slide. Now, we have the issue of DSI under the CBD, and the digital sequence information first emerged as an issue under the CBD and the Nagoya Protocol in 2016. And in 2018, COP14 recognized the importance of DSI for the third objective of the CBD, and that access to and use of DSI contribute to scientific research, as well as other non-commercial and commercial activities, and that further capacity to access, use, generate, and analyze data or analyze DSI is needed in many countries. Next slide. So this has been the process so far. On this slide, I indicate only from 2018 to 2022, but the process already started way back in 2016, 2018, in the sessional period, where parties were asked to submit views on the implications of DSI for the three objectives. And the issue is whether DNA sequence data and related information that is downloadable from public databases should be subject to the ABS framework applicable to genetic resources under the Nagoya Protocol. So in decision 14/20 and Nagoya Protocol decision 3/12 in November 2018, a process was put in place for parties to have a party-led process to discuss this issue. An ad hoc technical expert group was then established, and it had to do studies, views, and recommendations on various aspects that related to DSI. One, to clarify the concepts, including relevant terminology and scope of DSI on genetic resources, and if and how domestic measures on ABS can consider DSI on genetic resources, as well as benefit sharing arrangements from commercial and non-commercial use of DSI on genetic resources, and capacity building needs regarding the access, use, generation, and analysis of DSI on genetic resources, in particular for the objectives of the convention. And it also had the peer review studies on various aspects that related to DSI. Now, that attack led to outcomes on DSI, and I'll come to them just now. And this is happening within the context of the open-ended working group on the post-2020 global Bio-Diversity framework, which can be seen as some transformative action plan to hold, reverse, and address Bio-Diversity loss, because currently all studies, or most studies, are showing that we're not doing well as a global community in terms of managing biodiversity. And so as part of that package, DSI then came into being, or come to the fore. And all of these have to go to COP15 and be discussed there also by the meeting of the parties to the protocol. Intersessionally, there's been a informal co-chairs process, as well as a informal co-chairs advisory group that was asked to consider these issues further. Next slide. So from the work of the ARTEC regarding the scope and concept of DSI, they essentially came up with three groupings, and they said that these groupings can be considered as DSI or GSD, as you refer to it here. Group 1 is that DNA and RNA, and group 2 is DNA and RNA plus the proteins, and group 3 is DNA, RNA, proteins, metabolites, and other macromolecules. But they also noted the relevance of associated information that could be ecological interactions, as well as traditional knowledge that is associated with that genetic resource. Next slide. Through a series of webinars that was called or convened by the co-chairs of the working group, a number of policy options in that are proposing how to deal with this issue of DSI came to the fore. There is option 1, which is asking for a status quo, that the divergence that exists amongst the parties on what to do with DSI remains. And then option 1 is that DSI will be treated like a genetic resource, and therefore you require country pick and mat, bilateral system. And option 2, DSI require country mat, and that is again bilateral. Option 2.2, that DSI will require global mat, and then there are subsequent variations to that. Requirement payment for access to DSI, DSI data and research-related service products, and then with option 4, option 5, and option 6. Option 5 says that there should be no benefit sharing from DSI, whereas option 6 says that there is 1% levy on retail sales of genetic resources. The advisory group had considered these options and many other things, and so on Thursday, there is a webinar series that we are organizing Secretariat to inform parties and stakeholders about the official document on DSI on genetic resources that is prepared by the Executive Secretary for the working group at its 5th meeting that is due next month in Montreal. Next slide.
You're coming to the end?
Yep, we are getting to the end. So what are the concerns of mutual concern or for us, or the core issues? There is the inequity issues about data sharing and access to vaccines that has been deliberated upon already in this forum. And the context of COVID-19 pandemic has also outlined some challenges that we see in terms of the inequities. And this raised the issue of equitable access to public goods made from public data, including vaccines and health products. Another topic of equity for biodiversity and health is the efforts of indigenous peoples and local communities in conserving and protecting their lands, many of which are critical to global biodiversity that would result in less poverty, lower rates of deforestation, and better protection of the biodiversity and ecosystem functions on which these communities depends. So the CBD has been working on linkages between biodiversity and health over the last decade, including also on zoonotic diseases. That is the diseases that comes from animals. And what we are seeing is that there is the risks include land use change, agricultural expansion, intensification, wildlife consumption, that all of these also has an impact on pandemic, and that pandemics are driven by exponentially increasing anthropogenic changes. Next slide. So concluding, we can see that biodiversity loss, ecosystems degradation, and disease share many common drivers from the work under the CBD. Human disturbances of ecosystems and biodiversity loss are increasingly linked to the spread of zoonotic and vector-borne diseases. And so the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework may offer a stepping stone towards the 2050 vision of living in harmony with nature. And in this, there is the question of how can biodiversity assist us in preventing pandemics? And we believe that it is important for that. And preparedness is having access to pathogens, but also having access to vaccines and health products in general. And the common agenda between us is fair and equitable sharing of vaccines, fairness and equity that is in everyone's interest in terms of global wealth and global well-being. And from the biodiversity sector, we hear that the Nagoya Protocol is an obstacle, or maybe an obstacle, or could be a potential obstacle. And when such arise, collaboration is important to ease out the challenges. And there are more opportunities for linkages at the global level. We've seen the first draft of the WHO pandemic treaty, quoting the CBD and Nagoya Protocol, as well as the post-2020 global biodiversity framework. And communication will be key and is key. And between the Secretariat of the CBD and the WHO Secretariat, there's been numerous exchanges and talks to address this issue. And the advisory group also opened its doors and had quite a representation of industry, academia, and research. Notably, consumers seems to have been absent from that, from those talks. But open communication, collaboration, sharing of the interests and facts and issues will be helping us quite a lot. We are in one world and it is interlinked. We all have a role to play, and in this world in which we have to live. What will make us strong is not how similar we are in terms of approaches, in terms of the agendas that we deal with. What will make us strong is how different we are, because life gives us an example that only in diversity does life thrive. Thank you very much.